In 1954, in the heart of Glasgow's Gorbals district, a bizarre hysteria gripped the city. Children, armed with knives, stakes, and pure determination, descended upon a cemetery, hunting for a monster. Was it mass panic, or had they seen something truly terrifying? Join me today as I tell 4 chilling stories about Glasgow, Scotland, including the legend of the Gorbals Vampire. Several years ago, after a long week in Glasgow for a conference and with my work responsibilities complete, I finally had an evening to myself. I'd been looking for some way to experience the city, and as I walked back to my hotel, I saw an ad for a ghost tour posted on a billboard, and thus began my introduction to the dark side of the city of Glasgow. This is My Dark Path, where we explore conspiracies, the paranormal, and the unexplained. So, as the sun set, I found my way to the starting point of the ghost tour. The guide was lively and well-informed, not only about the legends of the places we were visiting, but about the history of the city of Glasgow. We walked the spooky, dark streets and made our first stop at the haunted Tron Theatre. Now, the theater was built on the site of the St. Mary's Church, which burned down in 1793, but left the iconic tower intact. St. Mary's Church had sat on the property since 1525, but the location had also served as a gathering hall, an execution site, and a police station. But in modern times, the theater's staff frequently report unusual events. Some claim that they've been watched, despite being alone in the space. Others have claimed to feel an icy touch. Perhaps the most ominous story is that of a threatening figure that appears in the basement boiler room. All these rumors and stories seem at home in a location that was burned to the ground, but perhaps the oddest claim about why the building might be haunted comes from the purported cause of the fire in 1793, a meeting of Glasgow's Hellfire Club. Reportedly, Tron Church was one of the stations for the night watchman who looked after the city after dark. On the night of February 15, 1793, the night watchman stepped out from his station to do his rounds, and while he was away, drunk members of the local Hellfire Club came upon his roaring fire. The party warmed themselves by the fire, and the relative comfort of the location enabled them to restart their drinking. And amid the partying, the fire too got out of control and destroyed the building. Why these events might make the Tron Theatre an unusually haunted location aren't entirely clear, but it hasn't made the location any less intriguing to ghost hunters. So, like most ghost tours, the participants definitely learn more about the city than they ever do experiencing the paranormal. But of all the ghostly stories we heard that night, the one that still sits vividly in my memory is that of Glasgow's body snatchers. And this wasn't even a paranormal event of suspect origins. Glasgow's body-snatching problem is very well documented. Now, the education of medical students has driven demand for human corpses for centuries. Scotland, where the study of anatomy and surgery goes back to 1505 when the Barber Surgeons of Edinburgh was formally incorporated as a draft guild of the city. It's likely that this may be the oldest surgical society in the world. The society's charter included the following statement, a bylaw that essentially required the procurement of human bodies. A member of this surgical society, quote, must know anatomy, nature, and complexion of the human body, that he know the nature and substance of everything that he works with, or else he is negligent, end quote. To satisfy this educational need, their charter allowed Scottish surgeons to dissect a single corpse every year, that of an executed criminal. But as the number of people studying anatomy and medicine increased, that single body became wildly insufficient. That is, until 1694 when Alexander Monteith negotiated with the Edinburgh Town Council to get access to more bodies. In this case, these corpses would be of those people who died while in prison. In exchange for expanding the number of corpses, Alexander would open an anatomy theater, something that would be called a surgeon's hall. The supply of corpses would further expand in 1752 when Scotland passed the Murder Act, legislation that claimed to be, quote, for better preventing the horrid crime of murder, end quote. The act required that anyone convicted of murder should not only be hanged, but then be given, quote, some further terror and peculiar mark of infamy, end quote. Apparently, this could be accomplished either by hanging the murderer in chains or providing their body for public dissection later. But in either case, the body, quote, would in no case whatsoever be suffered to be buried, end quote. It was government acts like this that caused the work of anatomists to be closely associated with criminality. So, while the supply of corpses for medical education expanded, demand continued to expand even faster, especially in the 18th and 19th century as scientific knowledge exploded. Medical students, too, wanted more opportunities to learn outside of the anatomy halls, centuries before they had access to Anki and other flashcard applications. It was in this moment where the so-called resurrection men and body snatchers stepped in to resolve the imbalance between supply and demand for corpses. The average corpse was worth about 10 pounds, or about $1,400 in today's value. As you might imagine, the growth of grave robbing also caused an explosion of innovations designed to protect the corpse of a loved one from being stolen. On one side, you had the outraged local populace trying to protect the remains of their loved ones, and on the other side, the body snatchers doing everything they could to acquire the corpse. Perhaps it's a bit impolite to say so, but the tension is reminiscent of the battle between car owners and the thieves attempting to steal catalytic converters. There were simple approaches, though, to foiling the resurrection men. Graves would be filled with layers of branches to make the digging more difficult. Others placed massive stones over the grave called mort stones. For example, in 1816, the Aberdeen Harbour Works gave a mort stone to the St. Fiddick Church graveyard. Since that time, the stone has disappeared, but others can be seen at graveyards nearby. Amid this tension between the bereaved and the body snatchers, it's important to remember one thing. The protections over a grave didn't have to last permanently. Instead, if the corpse could be kept interred for about 6 weeks, the decay would make it unusable. Mort stones were then abandoned as grave protection devices. Grave robbers simply angled their tunnel, dragging the corpse from one end of the coffin instead of digging straight down. Another solution to grave robbing emerged as some bodies were fixed to the coffin more or less permanently with a coffin collar. This was a thick iron necklace that was bolted to the coffin, and that made it impossible or nearly impossible to remove the body alone. There are still examples at several graveyards around Scotland, including at St. Andrew's Cathedral. Another escalation was the creation of the mort safe, or an iron cage that would enclose the coffin, secured with iron straps that prevented anyone from opening and retrieving the body. While expensive, this was often reused after a body had sufficiently decomposed. Of course, the wealthy could build crypts, protecting the body with stone walls. And then others began to build watch houses where paid guards would spend the night to prevent graveyard thievery. The simplest designs were mere shacks, but others became fully furnished rooms with windows and fireplaces. There's a more ornate one to be found at the Bantry Turnin graveyard near Aberdeen, Scotland. It's a 2-story tower complete with loopholes at the windows, allowing guards to steady their rifles. The tower included a large bell at the top to be used to alert others to the threat of resurrection men. Perhaps the most sophisticated mort house is the one at Udney Green in Aberdeenshire. This one was built in granite, but it included a vault where the coffins could be placed on a circular platform. When the next coffin was added, the previous one was advanced into the vault. Eventually, as coffins were added to the circular platform, the first one placed would return to the opening, but now at a stage of decomposition that it was of no use to grave robbers and could be safely buried. Ironically, the Udny Green Vault, the most innovative and secure of all the Mort houses, became obsolete the very year it was built in 1832. That was the year that the Anatomy Act was passed by both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, becoming law on August 1st. The tension around body snatching contributed to the passage of this Anatomy Act. The intent was to create a greater legal supply of bodies and thereby eliminate the need for the corpse black market. The act gave anatomists access to any unclaimed bodies, mainly those who died in prison and poorhouses. Additionally, the act required that anatomists become licensed and created 4 positions who would be the inspectors of anatomy. The year of 1832 was clearly a pivotal moment in the market for afterlife services. It was the year the Glasgow Necropolis was established. Almost 2 centuries earlier, in 1650, the Glasgow Merchants' House, a guild representing local businesses, purchased 37 acres of land from the estate of Wester Craigs. This land would eventually become the Glasgow Necropolis. The western end of the property is rocky and wasn't easily developed, so workers planted fir trees there, garnering the name of Fir Park. However, in 1804, the firs started to die and were replaced with willow and elm trees, which started the conversion of the park into a Victorian style. Glasgow's population had exploded in size in the early 1800s, tripling by 1830, but the rapid growth also brought disease. In November of 1832 alone, 3,000 people died of cholera. At this time, another piece of legislation passed Parliament, the Cemeteries Act. This law authorized the creation of private cemeteries to help alleviate overcrowded city cemeteries. And so, the year of 1832 was indeed a busy year for the dead, and would at the same time convert an unproductive property into a general and lucrative source of profit to a charitable institution." End quote. Strang also wrote that it was to be respectful to the dead, safe and sanitary to the living, and dedicated to the genius of memory, and to extend religious and moral feeling. To move forward with the conversion of Fir Park into a cemetery, the Merchants' House started a design competition with 5 prizes of £10 each. The contest was advertised in local newspapers. The Merchants' House received 16 proposals, and each was put in an exhibition. While David Bryce of Edinburgh won first prize and his brother John Bryce of Glasgow won second, the work was ultimately awarded to a landscape architect and gardener, George Milne. The work commenced and the first burial occurred in 1832, and it reflected the interdenominational approach of the necropolis, as the first person interred there was Joseph Levi, a Jew. Burials and construction continued in parallel. Ornamental entrance gates and a bridge were completed in 1836 and were named the Bridge of Sighs. The necropolis expanded in 1860 with an extension to the east and to the south. The necropolis's original design included a series of catacombs under the main hill, a design intended to thwart the work of the resurrection men. But the Anatomy Act had eliminated the need for illegally procured corpses, and so the original catacomb designs were never built. Still, the cemetery expanded again in 1877 and then again in 1893, doubling its size and reaching its current proportions. The Glasgow City Council took over management of the necropolis in 1966 from the Merchants' House, and today 50,000 burials have taken place, and the necropolis is one of the first few to keep files about the dead, including their profession, age, sex, and cause of death. And with that number of burials, it's perhaps not surprising that the Glasgow Necropolis is rife with ghostly sightings. There are actually 4 necropolises in Glasgow. Just across the River Clyde to the south is the Southern Necropolis that features one gravestone as the epicenter of many of the ghostly stories. The gravestone is more than just a marker. It's a full statue in white stone of a woman cloaked with her head bent toward the ground. And while her features are eroded, whether by time and elements or vandals, the figure still evokes a feeling of sorrow. No doubt this was the intent of the man who placed it there. The statue stands over two graves, that of Magdalene Smith and her housekeeper, Mary McNaughton. Magdalene's husband, John Smith, erected it to memorialize the two women who died after being struck by a tram as they were headed home from church. Stories and rumors claim that the statue's face will follow visitors to the necropolis as they wander the grounds. Some even claim that the statue will turn you to stone. The former seems hard to determine given the state of the face that I described. The latter claim, however, seems without substantiation, as I didn't see any statues of ghost hunters scattered about the grounds. The other reason why there aren't more people turned to stone is that everyone who comes across the statue follows a set of instructions. Although I think that the instructions seem to be more for the benefit of allowing Glasgow locals to see who the tourists are. You see, to prevent yourself being turned to stone, you're supposed to run around the statue, loudly calling out the words, "White Lady," 3 times. And on a separate trip to Glasgow, I was particularly interested in bumping into the White Lady ghost. She'd been spotted quite a few times floating through the gravestones, but who she is and what happened to her that made her turn into a ghost, we don't know. But what we do know is fascinating. Ghost ladies in white dresses have been spotted in different cultures, different continents, and different races. Invariably, they're tall, have black hair that covers their faces, wear white dresses or wedding dresses, and are thin. These white lady ghosts across different parts of the world have an uncanny resemblance with each other, and they've become something of a phenomenon. They're also called woman in white or a weeping woman. A woman in white is a female ghost who was betrayed by her husband or lover in life. In some myths, she killed her children before taking her own life. In recorded history, one of the earliest appearances of a lady in white was in the Czech Republic in the 15th century. Legend has it that a nobleman was in a bad marriage, and when he was dying, he asked forgiveness from his wife, but she refused. The nobleman cursed her, and to this day she haunts the holdings of the nobleman, which include the Český Krumlov Castle. A lot of White Lady sightings have been reported in mountainous areas where she tries to hitch a ride from a driver. The White Lady of Whoopsie haunts the Wapsanonoc Mountain and Buckhorn Mountain in the western part of Altoona, Pennsylvania. The source of this story is that the ghost's husband had an ill-fated crash, and she's been looking for him ever since. When picked up as a hitchhiker, drivers reported that her reflection wasn't seen. In the Philippines, she operates differently. She can appear anywhere. At times, she would hail a cab, only to disappear. The Filipino White Lady has caused many accidents due to drivers panicking at her sight. While I might have been disappointed not to be confronted with this lady in white directly, I did learn of another unusual event that took place in the southern necropolis in 1954. It was an event involving a vampire and an angry mob of hundreds hunting for an elusive prince of the night. Now, if you imagine an angry mob and think of a large, irrational crowd brandishing weapons and torches, you're not far off in this case. But this vampire hunt was, as I said, unusual. As in this case, the mob was composed entirely of children who were genuinely seeking a vampire they were certain was real. In September of 1954, decades before the Twilight series made vampires popular with young adults, rumors had spread among the school children in the Gorbals neighborhood of Glasgow. The children, it seemed, were convinced that a 7-foot-tall vampire with iron teeth had killed 2 of their classmates and was now hunting for more victims, and thus began the story of the Gorbals Vampire. Adults who lived nearby took note that afternoon when the kids first began to flood the graveyard, but they didn't pay much attention to begin with. There were few public parks at the time, and the necropolis was a great playground for children. When the Glasgow police were alerted to the disturbance at the southern necropolis and were dispatched, they arrived expecting to find vandals. The sight of hundreds of children baffled the responding police. They started trying to talk with the roving bands of kids and learned that a singular rumor had drawn all of the youngsters to the graveyard. Every child reported that the vampire with iron teeth had killed and eaten 2 of their classmates, and reportedly every child was certain of this fact. One man who participated in the hunt as a child said of the event, quote, "We didn't have Christopher Lee to explain you had to put a stake through the heart to kill him. We were just going to cut the head off. End of story." End quote. There are conflicting accounts, but news reports of that period were certain that the police struggled to figure out what was really happening. Some news reports say that the children went home when it started raining. Others claim that it was a schoolmaster who finally sent the kids home. But the most common belief is that the kids only went home when darkness made their hunt impossible. But even darkness didn't last. The kids returned on 2 subsequent days, again hunting for this elusive Gorbals vampire. Their hunt was, of course, in vain, but the events added fuel to a censorship controversy that was burning in Parliament. Was the Gorbals vampire simply a creature born of mass hysteria and children's imaginations, or was it something more? A research paper published in 1985 noted that the Gorbals vampire incident wasn't that unusual. The researchers, Sandy Hobbs and David Cornwell, found that the children of Glasgow had formed several hunts through the 1930s and 1940s. Every hunt had had a different target: a ghostly lady in white, a banshee, and a creature called Spring-Heeled Jack. And surprisingly, the child mob hadn't been the only one in the fall of that year. A Scottish newspaper had reported that 1 week after the Gorbals vampire hunt, another mob of children had surrounded and stoned a caravan of gypsies. The attack was miles from the Gorbals event and was, therefore, composed likely of different children. But the mob mentality was strikingly similar to the events of the necropolis. The Gorbals hunt was widely reported because it aligned with a moral panic that had ripped through the United States only a few months earlier. At this time, an effort to ban crime and horror comics had reached a new milestone in the United States. And in the spring of 1954, the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency had held hearings on comic books, resulting in the writing of a restrictive comics code that effectively censored horror comics from existence. After the passage of the code, no comic book could be sold if it contained any scene of horror. There was a group that also wanted to eliminate horror comics in the UK. In a 1999 book, Pulp Demons, Martin Barker writes that in the early 1950s, a group of teachers, clergy, and parents had tried to get horror comics banned. While their case was even taken up by Parliament, their efforts were frustrated when some of their more sensational claims were debunked by the UK's Home Secretary. The fact that many of the group's leaders were exposed as Communist Party members didn't help. The group tried again in 1953 with the creation of the Comics Campaign Council, which was led by a respected pediatrician and Communist Party member. One leader of the Comics Campaign Council was quoted as saying, quote, "Sadism and violence are basic themes throughout the American-type comics," end quote. The Comics Campaign Council began to make some headway as other organizations, including the British Medical Association, took up the cause of vilifying horror comics. In September of 1954, they were handed a gift as the account of the mass hysteria and frightened Scottish children of the Gorbals vampire hunt was published across the country. Newspapers linked the Gorbals vampire event to horror comics, writing headlines like, quote, "Is this the kind of comic your child is reading?" End quote. Also, the vampire hunt was included in the February 1955 debate in Parliament, where an MP stated that the anti-comics legislation was necessary to protect UK children by, quote, "freeing their minds from evil influences," end quote. All of this political pressure was successful, and the Children and the Young Persons Harmful Publications Act was made law in the spring of 1955. And while comics were not explicitly described in the law, the act did regulate publications that told stories in picture form, showing crime, acts of violence, or incidents of a repulsive nature. And the law criminalized their publication, sale, or importation. Police were also given stronger powers to search and seize these publications. And it's ironic, as many credit an 1825 publication, The Glasgow Looking Glass, as the first comic book. Apparently, the law is still on the books, but today never enforced. So did American comics incite the hunt for the Gorbals Vampire? Likely not, but there were plenty of local legends that inspired fear of the supernatural. A witch-like figure, Jenny with the Iron Teeth, was a popular poem written by Scotsman Alexander Anderson. His poem was intended to scare children into complying with bedtime, as Jenny would only steal awake children, after of course using her iron teeth on their plump bodies. So while I appreciate the parental desire to enforce bedtime routines, perhaps this is not the ideal story to use if you didn't want children to wake up with nightmares. But other children who participated in the Gorbals vampire hunt recall stories perhaps inspired by the necropolis's proximity to the Dixon Blazes ironworks. One man recalls a story told by his great-grandfather of an iron man, and others remember stories of a man with iron teeth. The children's pursuit of a diversion, even for something as morbid as a vampire hunt, might be connected to the living conditions in Glasgow. After World War II, the UK paper The Daily Mail observed that the residents of Gorbals faced some of the worst conditions in post-war Europe. Families lived in overcrowded tenements with poor sanitation. Children chased rats through the streets with pickaxes and sticks. Martin Baker, the author we identified earlier, hypothesized that children of the area welcomed any flight of imagination to distract them from life in Gorbals. In a 2016 interview with the BBC, he said, quote, "It's a miserable place to live, and you're looking for something to give you a spark of excitement in your life. What you've got here is a lovely example of children's cultures in action. Sometimes they're complicated, sometimes they get out of control, but there's a lot to be learnt about the way children talk with each other, share rumors, tell stories, and so on." And today, centuries after the need for resurrection men and the Cemetery Act, and more than 100 years since the creation of the Glasgow Necropolis, and decades after the Gorbals vampire hunt, what are we left with? Sometimes, perhaps, when we hunt for ghosts, we find other creepy stories that, despite our best efforts, are as ephemeral as the specters we seek. Thank you for joining me in this episode of My Dark Path. I'm MF Thomas, the creator and host. If you enjoyed what you just saw, please like the video and subscribe. And we'll see you next week as we walk the dark paths of the world together. In the meantime, my friends, good night.